Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the second webinar of this year hosted by Partners Against Mortality and Epilepsy, or PAME. As you may know, PAME's mission is to convene, educate, and inspire all stakeholders, from the bereaved to those living with epilepsy, to healthcare professionals, advocates, clinical and basic scientists, and death investigators, to drive the prevention of epilepsy-related mortality. My name is Jeanne Donalty, and I'm honored to deliver today's welcoming remarks on behalf of all those who have lost a loved one to SUDEP. I became part of the epilepsy community on February 21st, 2002, over 20 years ago, when our son Christopher died from SUDEP. He was 21 years old, a senior at Stanton University at the time of his death. Looking forward to beginning the next chapter of his life, all the opportunities the world held for him. Like most of you, we had never been told about SUDEP or heard about it, and to the best of our knowledge, neither had Christopher. What does one do with this? Early on, I made Christopher a promise that his death would not be the end of his story. He wanted to make a difference in the world, and I would help him do this. I would tell his story. I was determined to bring SUDEP to the attention of the epilepsy community, and soon became aware of Citizens United for Research in Epilepsy, an organization I joined, which gave me a platform to advance this agenda. Around the same time, a small group of physicians and researchers were coming together to tackle the SUDEP issue, including doctors Buckholder, So, Hirsch, Donner, Goldman, Feingold, and Nobles. And more families who had experienced a SUDEP death were speaking out. The families of Danny Stanton, Henry Lapham, Chelsea Hutchinson, Patrick Ring, and Tyler Stevenson, to name a few. All true pioneers whose work has been transformative. But there is still so much left to do. A fellow cure mom once said to me that treating epilepsy with drugs is like putting a person on chemotherapy for the rest of their lives. This always stuck with me. This makes the topic of today's webinar so important and timely. As we think about this topic, devices for epilepsy, I gain hope in viewing this space as a disruption of the treatment status quo that patients and caregivers have experienced for too long. After thousands of years of epilepsy as a disorder, caregivers and patients still face too much anxiety, stress, and fear when thinking about how seizures impact their lives. The technology that we see across our society today presents an opportunity for a shift. The technology within the epilepsy space right now is by no means perfect, but as we prioritize our research and development into better resources for people who face seizures, technology should absolutely be included. To give a preview of our webinar speakers today, first we'll have Dr. Talia Shear of Lurie Children's Hospital in Chicago sharing a physician's point of view about the use of devices. Next, Tom Stanton from the Danny Did Foundation will provide an overview of the device marketplace as it stands today, and considerations for how to select the best device for you or your patient. And our final speaker, Dr. Pedro Irazoqui from Johns Hopkins University, will talk to you about the future for devices in epilepsy, including the use of artificial intelligence, prediction capabilities, and products that are in the pipeline. After our speakers, we hope to have about 10 minutes remaining to answer questions that are submitted by our viewers. Please type your questions into the Q&A box and we will address as many as we can. Now I'd like to welcome our first speaker, Dr. Talia Shear a pediatric neurologist whose practice includes diagnosing and treating seizures. She has a particular interest in managing neurological concerns in children with medical complexity. In her practice, she strives to make families and patients feel comfortable and heard as a committed partner in their care. Dr. Shear, I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you so much. Let me just get my slides up. Thank you so much for having me here today. As mentioned, I'm Dr. Scheer. I'm practicing in Chicago as a pediatric neurologist, and I'm really grateful to have the opportunity to speak with you all today and share physician, or specifically neurologist perspectives on wearable devices for seizure detection. Common way that discussions of wearable devices come up in my practice is soon after I diagnose a child with epilepsy. The family will often then ask me, well, what if I miss a seizure? Or how do I know if my child's having a seizure at night? These are very common questions. And so along with discussing how to make sure the child's environment is safe should they have an undetected seizure, this also often is an opportunity for me to share the potential role of wearable devices with families. The potential benefits of wearable devices include both seizure detection and a record of seizure activity. So detecting seizures, of course, can allow caregivers to be alerted to seizures, so that question about what if I miss one, what if it happens at night, caregivers may be able to be alerted to a seizure happening. And this can allow the family or caregiver to intervene to make sure the patient or the child is in a safe position, they're on their sides, that any rescue medications are administered if it's a longer seizure, and that in certain situations, emergency medical services are alerted as soon as possible. So there's no devices currently that have been proven to prevent SUDEP, but since SUDEP happens most commonly during sleep, some people who have seizures at night may be helped by having a way to let other people know when a seizure occurs. Some wearable devices may also be able to assess changes that occur right before a seizure happens, so therefore predict that the seizure is about to occur. So one of the, most families with epilepsy will tell you this, one of the most challenging things about epilepsy is its unpredictability, not being able to know when a seizure is about to happen. And while we don't have the technological advancements as of yet to predict seizures, it's possible in the future that these devices not only alert when a seizure is about to happen, but might also give us a sense of high seizure likelihood periods, so that this can help guide families plan things like vacation. Having detection devices can ultimately give peace of mind for both the parent and the patient. And it might also allow the patient to have more autonomy, such as sleeping in their own room again if they've been sleeping in the same room as their parents. And overall, this hasn't been studied thoroughly yet, but ultimately, for all the reasons I just discussed, these devices may ultimately improve caregiver and patient quality of life. Seizure detection devices can also serve as a record for seizure activity, and therefore serve as an electronic seizure diary for us neurologists to review. So this can be immensely helpful for a number of reasons. Caregivers usually do a very, very good job reporting seizures to us. But more subtle seizures can be missed, or abnormal movements or behaviors might be interpreted as seizure, but not actually seizure. And so there can sometimes be a lack of consistency between reports of seizure and seizure reported on other things like EEG, or a look at the brain waves. And we as clinicians really rely on these reports of seizure activity at home to make important decisions, such as whether to adjust a medication, an anti-seizure medication, or add an anti-seizure medication. So ideally, we have the most accurate information possible. We also need to consider, for example, if we think a patient has well-controlled seizures, we may say it's safe to drive. And of course, if they're continuing to actually have undetected seizures or seizures we don't know about, that can be incredibly dangerous. The flip side is if we think someone's having seizures and those events aren't actually seizure, that might lead us to, for example, increased doses of their medication, and that can lead to potential side effects. As physicians, we also need to consider when it comes to these devices, what is the sensitivity of this device and what is the specificity? And this is a concept actually all of us have probably, unfortunately, in a way become familiar with the COVID pandemic. So when taking an at-home COVID test, many of us have wondered if we got test back and the test came back negative, was it accurate? Were we truly negative? And so we wanted to have that comfort that our test was truly negative. So we want the test to have a high specificity. We also want to know that if we're positive, that the test is going to detect that. So we don't inadvertently expose others to COVID. So we want a test with high sensitivity. So now let's think about this from the perspective of epilepsy. A wearable device for seizure detection ideally would have high sensitivity and specificity. So sensitivity in the scenario of wearable devices for epilepsy refers to the device's ability to detect a seizure when one is actually happening. A high sensitivity, therefore, ensures that we're not missing seizures and that we're being alerted to seizures when they're happening. Specificity, on the other hand, relates to the test's ability to correctly detect when something is not a seizure. So for complicated reasons, the wearables will report on something called a false alarm rate instead of specificity. But just like it sounds, a false alarm is when the device alerts for something that is not a seizure. So this could happen, for example, if someone's brushing their teeth and maybe the device interprets that as a seizure. And ultimately, these devices cannot have too many false alarms. If there's too many false alarms, this can lead to a lot of caregiver anxiety. All of us have probably experienced times where there's so many false alarms, you start ignoring alarms. And ultimately, if there's too many false alarms, this may just lead to discontinuation of the device completely. As clinicians, we also need to consider the types of seizures our patients have when talking about wearable devices with families and whether these devices are actually designed to detect them. So this is a very busy slide, but this is what we in neurology use to classify seizures. This is developed by the International League Against Epilepsy and continually updated. This is the most recent one. And so you can see there's several different seizure types. Most of the devices currently available can detect these generalized tonic-clonic seizures. So those are seizures where the patient's unconscious and has rhythmic shaking movements of their extremities. But so the devices aren't thus far designed for things like absence seizures. So those are the staring spell type seizures or certain focal seizures, seizures coming from one side of the brain. Although focal motor seizures, so seizures that involve some sort of movement, might be able to trigger the device. So ultimately, many seizure types cannot yet be reliably detected with the devices we have. All of that is to say, these devices offer a lot of promise, but there's still a lot of technological development that needs to be done. So as I mentioned, a key gap for current evidence for devices is their performance accuracy for focal onset seizures or seizures without any sort of motor feature. Since almost all of the evidence we have thus far is specific to generalized tonic-clonic seizures. The other thing to consider is some patients have several different seizure types, but a device may be designed just to detect one type in particular. Additionally, for some of these devices, there's a lack of what we call real-world validity, meaning that we don't know whether some of the study findings can be applied to real-life settings. So a lot of these devices were studied in the hospital in what are called epilepsy monitoring units. And as you can imagine, that's a very controlled setting, very different than the home environment. And so it's hard to know if those devices would do just as well in a home environment. We are also relying on as I talked about earlier with a record of seizures, we're relying on the information that the device provides, but there's always a risk of data loss. For example, if the wearable device is connected to a cell phone via Bluetooth and there's a disconnection, or if the memory on the server is full, or if the wearable's battery dies, data can be lost that way. And data quality is also a concern. For example, if the wearable is worn on a wrist, and let's say it's not worn as tightly as it needs to be, that can affect the quality of the data that we have. So ultimately, we need more scientific evidence to prove how well these seizure alert devices work, and if they're helpful in preventing SUDEP. And if they are helpful in preventing SUDEP, what are the specific features that are most important? Is it oxygen level? Is it heart rate? What are the key parameters we need to be measuring in order to keep patients safe? Ultimately, we know that many caregivers are interested in these devices and want to learn more. And so if you're a caregiver and you're interested, I encourage you to talk to your neurologist and learn more. The Danny Did Foundation website is also a really excellent resource and has a lot of great information. Ultimately, the hope is that these wearable devices will help guide clinical decision-making and provide comfort to families, but there's still a lot to be done. And you'll hear more about some potential advancements in the future. Hopefully this scientific evidence in the future is going to guide development and access to these devices so that families can really benefit from them. And from that, I will pass it over to Tom.
Thank you, Dr. Scheer, for that presentation. Next, we'll hear from Tom Stanton of the Danny Did Foundation. Danny Did is a Chicago-based nonprofit and a partner member.
Looks like we might have lost Jeanne, so I'll jump in where she left off. Just to say that Danny Did is based in Chicago, and we're a partner to the PAME collaboration, and very happy to be a part of the PAME community. So I just want to introduce myself. Like Jeanne said, I'm Tom Stanton. I'm the president of Danny Did, and we got our start in the epilepsy community after my nephew Danny, who you can see here in the red shirt, passed away from SUDEP when he was 4 years old. So just a brief background of Danny's story. He was a healthy, athletic, loving boy, and he only had 4 seizures that his parents had witnessed over the course of about 2 years. And all of them were during sleep. And it was about 3 months before his 5th birthday when Danny had a scheduled neurologist appointment, and they left there feeling hopeful that they were on the right track and that they would maybe even see Danny outgrow his seizures at some point. And then it was 4 days later, on December 12th of 2009, that he was found unresponsive in his bed and had passed away from SUDEP. So the one thing about Danny's story that we've come to know is unfortunately too common, was that his parents had never been counseled about the risk of SUDEP. And that is something that we're very committed to trying to change at the Danny Did Foundation in collaboration with PAME and others, is just to increase the disclosure around this particular risk, just to empower parents and to try to make the advancements in figuring out what causes SUDEP occur more rapidly. So I'll start my slides just by kind of highlighting some of the benefits that we see for patients and caregivers in terms of monitoring and alerting devices. You can see here, a lot of you may be using devices, or if you're a caregiver, a provider, you may know that your patients are using them. So they're in the epilepsy community, and given that, we want to make sure that they're as effective and as well utilized as possible. Obviously, seizure tracking is a huge issue for patients, caregivers, and providers. And just to the degree that these systems can help count when seizures are happening can be very beneficial. And then just the idea of intervention, you know, that someone could be present either during or right after a seizure to take the steps that you can take if you are in fact in the room is a big talking point. We believe very strongly that could lead to better outcomes. And then we hear all the time from parents, you know, just the peace of mind that can be gained from the idea that they will be alerted if a seizure takes place. And then the accompanying independence that can happen for a patient, certainly of you know, middle school or older ages as they want more independence. Sometimes these devices can provide that, and that can do wonders for them. We think it's really important for providers to also understand the benefits from these devices, or the potential benefits. The first one, you know, we think is super important, just engaging patients or caregivers into their own care, making them really direct agents in trying to get to a better place with their epilepsy. And then all the things that can come from intervention, hopefully leading to better outcomes after a seizure. That's obviously very relevant for providers. The seizure tracking I discussed, this is super applicable to providers as well, trying to combat some of the patient or caregiver recall issues that occur for very valid reasons within the epilepsy community. And then the idea that the more accurate data can lead to more optimal medication and the benefits that could bring. Those are all, I think, notable benefits for healthcare providers. We definitely are always upfront that this space is in its early stages. There's a lot of work to be done, a lot of progress to be made. This slide outlines some of the current shortcomings in the device space. We talk about, you know, the validation of the sensitivity and the specificity that Dr. Scheer alluded to. What exactly is being measured? Is it uniform across all studies? And then just the idea that there's a stigma sometimes to having a wearable for the person with epilepsy, and how can that be accounted for or worked around. And then the idea of access is a big talking point for us, specifically at Danny Did. We hear from families every day who do not have access. Unfortunately, there's not much insurance coverage or reimbursement involved with epilepsy devices today. So next, I'm just going to kind of overview kind of some of the common sense considerations that we encourage for patients or caregivers when they're turning to us for some counseling. I will say, you know, just to be clear, Danny Did is not, we don't aim to endorse a certain device or to say, this is what you should use specifically, but really we want to be this neutral, objective entity that helps patients or caregivers to think through the considerations that will hopefully lead them to the best selection when it comes to devices. So the first one we talk about is just aligning what the device professes to alert to with the seizure types, and do those two things sync up? Right now, as you guys probably know, a lot of the systems are oriented towards movement monitoring. So just making sure that the seizure type and the detection type are in alignment. And then thinking through what are the goals for the device. So, you know, is it seizure tracking? And if it is, you know, how is that data shared and collected and recorded? Is it to be alerted? So there's some type of intervention. And if that's the goal, how are the alerts administered? And is that optimal for the household or for the users of the system? And then number 3 is really important, maybe obvious, but just if I have a child who's 3 years old, are they really going to keep a watch on? Or if we're trying to use a pulse oximeter overnight, is keeping it on a finger or a toe realistic for the user? So just thinking through, in the midst of wanting to be hopeful and wanting to find another layer of support for the seizures that are taking place, also being clear-eyed and upfront about how that's going to actually unfold within the context of who's using it. And then the fourth just relates to the general range of technological aptitude that we have in society. Some people are very adept at using different technologies, and some feel more intimidated or challenged by it. So figuring out what exactly is involved with each of these products, and if there's tutorials that you can watch in advance or questions that you can ask of the manufacturer, it really will help to make sure that the system can be used reliably over time. And then the last one is arguably the one that we get the most questions about, and that is just access. What do these devices cost? Is there a one-time cost? Are there reoccurring monthly or annual costs that are subscription-based? What kind of coverage is there, if any, from health insurance or other types of coverage? And that's where we hear from a lot of people that they need support in that final consideration of cost. So next, I'm just going to talk through a few of the products at the marketplace today. This list is not meant to be exhaustive by any means, but these are some of the resources that are available today. This list is non-invasive, so we're not talking about VNS or RNS. These are either wearable or non-invasive systems that are in the marketplace today. The first one here you can see is called the MFit movement monitor. This features a very thin device that goes between the box spring and the mattress, and it's looking for certain types of movement that can be detected for someone sleeping in bed. So this is a nocturnal oriented monitoring, and the alarm sounds in the room of the user. This next one is the Inspire app by a company called Smart Monitor. And this is a system that can be used if there's someone outside the household, whether they're at school or maybe at work or riding public transportation. The alert is delivered through a text message and or a phone call. There's a preset list of contacts that can be inserted. And this is desirable for some who have either older children or adults that are not in the same household and you want to be notified. The next system is similar. It's called the Embrace Watch. This is probably the most well-known amongst the epilepsy devices, primarily because it achieved FDA approval for an indication of movement. So while the system is designed to do more than just alert to movement, the indication itself is specifically for movement. And so this is made by a company called Empatica, and it delivers alerts similar to the Inspire through text message, phone call, and through the app itself. This system, the Sleep Activity Monitor, or SAMI, is one that some caregivers like because it captures a video. If the alarm is triggered, there's a video recording that can be shared with a provider or reviewed by the caregivers. It's very similar to the setup of a baby monitor. It's important to note with this and any of the systems, issues of privacy. So thinking through, if you have a teenager or a young adult, are they comfortable to be monitored through this camera-like setup? But this is a system that we get a lot of inquiries about. The MIKU Monitor is one that will alert to an absence of breathing after a specified amount of time. So this system is being actually further developed through some trials at Boston Children's Hospital to be more applicable for people with epilepsy, but to the degree that a caregiver may want to be alerted to an absence of breathing, this is a system that aims to do that. And then just a general category of pulse oximeters. So if you are looking to have blood oxygen saturation or heart rate alerted to, this is something to consider. This is typically a prescribed system. So it's a little bit more nuanced in terms of getting access. Usually comes through a durable medical equipment supplier. But there are plenty of families that have implemented this as a kind of a monitoring system within their home. I'm going to skip my next slide because Pedro is going to speak to this. So I do want to take a minute just to focus on our place at Danny Did. We have a program in place where we provide funding directly to families who are trying to gain access to a monitoring device but face a financial barrier. So we encourage anybody to reach out to learn more through our website, which is dannydid.org. But essentially, you'll submit an application, we'll have a phone call, and then we'll see if there's an alignment. And then we provide funds, if there is, that help a family to get the resource into their home. As I mentioned before, we really put the impetus on the caregiver or the patient to make the decision, and we help counsel them on some things to consider. So we've given out grants to about over 2,100 families across 14 countries. So we have a lot of experience in talking through different scenarios, and we really want to make these products available to the degree that they can be helpful. So with that, I'll just say we're here, to talk to anybody who might want to connect after this webinar, and we really do want to keep Danny's legacy alive by helping families in the epilepsy community. And I'm not sure, Jeanne, are you still having audio difficulties? If so, I can. Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, I got you now, Jeanne.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Tom, for that great information and for all the important work that the Danny Did Foundation does. We all are very appreciative of all of that. As our final speaker, we'll hear from Pedro Irazoqui, who serves as head of the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering at Johns Hopkins University. He's an expert in developing the tools of electrical engineering to create medical devices that can be worn or implanted to track patient biomarkers associated with diseases. And Pedro, I'll turn the slides over to you.
Thank you, Jeanne. Thank you all. It's a real honor to be here and talk to you today about our research. My very first grant, almost 17 years ago, that I wrote as a university professor was to Citizens United for Research in Epilepsy, Scheer, and it was for the Christopher Donalty Award, named after Jeanne's son. And that's how I first learned about SUDEP. And when we got that grant, we got to meet Jeanne and her family and many others who had stories to tell about their children. And that completely transformed the direction of my lab and the students that have come after me over these last 17 years. So the impact is immeasurable, at least it was for me. But let me talk to you briefly today about the work that we do in closed loop, meaning responsive neural stimulation or neural prostheses, specifically for SUDEP. So for us, this all started with a look at trying to replicate SUDEP in an animal model. And what we found was that in an animal, particularly in seizing rats, we could record, because this is what we do, we're electrical engineers, so we build widgets to tie into the body, and we could record electrical activity in the brain. We could record electrical activity resulting from breathing. We could record heart rate, we could record blood pressure, and we can do this in animals that are dying as a result of their seizures. And what we found was that the breathing stops first, then the heart, then the brain, and that's important. because we were then able to connect that to the idea that you have something called an oxygen conserving reflex, which we all have. And these include things like a laryngospasm or a mammalian diving reflex that is triggered in normal, healthy individuals to keep you from aspirating the contents of your stomach or inhaling water when you fall in the water. They're life-preserving reflexes. But in a patient that has epilepsy and that is in the midst of a seizure, at least in our animal models, this is what causes SUDEP. I'm not saying this is always what causes SUDEP, but in our animal models, it is. And so then we set around to engineer a device to address this clinical need. And that engineered device needed to be able to sense these different signals so we could detect a seizure, we could detect respiratory distress, and then we could combine the two. A lot of that understanding of the data in real time involved processing and real-time processing and artificial intelligence. It involved telemetry. We need to get the data out of the device so we can process it in a supercomputer and eventually perhaps be able to process it on the device. We also need to be able to power our implants. And then finally, ideally, we need to be able to actuate. We need to be able to deliver a therapy electrically or pharmacologically to the patient to save their life when a caregiver is not nearby and able to do so. So I'll talk rather briefly about each of these over the next few minutes. So the sensing side was driven by a challenge we saw almost immediately, which is that every commercially available neural recording electrode available on the market at the time that we started did not work for more than 2 weeks because they were large enough and stiff enough that if you put them in the brain, they would work the minute you first inserted them, but then over time they would cause a glial or a scar formation around the electrode, which would make them stop working. So over the course of subsequent years, we developed a new inserter that would insert electrodes thinner than a human hair and very flexible. And these would allow us to record individual neurons in the brain firing away. And we could do it on day 1 and day 8 and all the way out to day 50 and beyond for hundreds of days without losing our ability to record those cells. So that gave us access to a type of data that no one else had. And when we talk about signal processing, it's all about the data you have access to. So what do I mean by that? So if you look at the data that you can record from a brain undergoing a seizure, and this is all data out of my lab, and you start off actually on the right-hand side, and you look at all the cumulative data over all the time, and you wonder, how big is the signal? Let me back up a little bit. So the way most people think about seizure detection is they look at it and they say, okay, I know what signal is involved in epilepsy, so I know what I'm looking for. The fundamental sort of the element in artificial intelligence and machine learning is that we look at data and we don't begin by saying, I know what I'm looking for. We begin by saying, I have no idea what I'm looking for. I'm going to ask the computer to figure out for me what it is that I'm looking for. And so what you see on the right-hand side here is the computer is telling us that what you're looking for is an element or a feature that is about 250 milliseconds long. And what you see in the left-hand side is that if we go looking for different kinds of features, the computer learns what kind of 250 millisecond feature you want to see. And it can tell you along the x-axis, the raw data here, which point in time you saw the feature. The yellow means you found a feature that is detecting a seizure. And then we can pull out the electrical recordings from the brain at that point in time, and we can share them with neurologists. But this data tracks very, very well to when the animal is having a seizure. And then if we couple that with data that tells us when the animal is not breathing, then we can combine it into a prediction, not just of seizures, but a prediction of SUDEP. And we do this initially on a supercomputer that's located off the patient. And eventually, once we've trained our algorithm up, then we can download those trained parameters onto the implant and run it so that the implant itself can detect seizures and it can detect the onset of SUDEP and possibly a little more than that. But we need to power these implants and we need to get the data in and out of these implants. To power them, we use something called magnetic resonance coupling. We have a few other ways as well, but in a nutshell, what we're doing here, and this is a photograph of one of our devices, you can see these copper coils. They pick up magnetic fields, they turn them into currents, And ordinarily, they would behave like this red curve. So you get lots of energy in your implantable device if you're just exactly at the right frequency. What we've done is we've turned it into the blue curve by designing our own circuit. This is a microchip that we designed and fabricated, and we put inside of some of our implantable devices. And that allows the device to not work quite as well at the sweet spot, but to work much better everywhere else. And that makes it much more robust and reliable. So the implants are tiny, so they're easy to implant. That means they're wirelessly powered, and we figured out ways of doing that wirelessly powering very efficiently. We've also figured out ways of getting the data in and out. To get the data out, we build our own microchips. Here's another photograph. This is a little under a millimeter on each dimension. So it's like a grain of sand, but on it, it's got a radio transmitter and the digital circuitry that you need. In fact, this one even has some RF powering on it, so we can power the implant, so we can get data out with high fidelity. We can also do it in a closed loop or responsive way. So you can record the data, you can get the data out, your supercomputer running off somewhere in a server farm can decide when there's, or determine when there's a seizure and when there's SUDEP. And then it can tell the implant it's happening now, stimulate, deliver therapy to resuscitate the patient. And so these are examples of chips that we build that we incorporate in our devices. And then the last piece is, all right, so now we've been able to record, we've been able to figure out when is a seizure happening. We can detect when respiratory distress is occurring. And in our models, respiratory distress is always the cause of death. We can tell the device it's happening now. Now we need to develop therapy. And we're going to try to do it using vagal nerve stimulation. And using VNS stimulation, we started using electrodes, cuff electrodes that wrap around the brain, like the one on your left here. And what we found is that, again, just like recording, things work really well for a few days, but not very well for a few weeks or years. We found the same thing was true for stimulation. And we found it, if you look at the image on the right, on the far right, you have a picture of a nerve and there's parts of speckles of light. That's fluorescence. So we've injected a fluorescent tracer in the stomach, which gets absorbed by the vagus nerve. It's one of your cranial nerves that goes all over your viscera and up into your brain. And it's the one that's used for stimulation in the LevoNova, or Cyberonics formerly, implantable vagal nerve stimulator. And what we found in animals, not in humans, but in animals, we found that if you cuff the nerve over a period of time, the light in the brain that comes from the nerve goes away because the signals in the nerve die because the cuff is mechanically restricting and pulling on that nerve and causing damage. We do not know that this is also happening in humans. We don't know that it's not happening in humans. But my sense is that what we need to do is we need to develop a technology that doesn't touch the nerve so we can deliver this therapy without causing nerve damage in animals, and then definitely not in humans. And that's what we've been working on. So can we take two signals, instead of one stimulus signal, can we take two signals, and can we deliver them from an electrode that is now far away from the nerve? So it's not touching the nerve, it's not pulling on the nerve. And then we combine those signals, and one signal by itself won't stimulate and the other signal won't stimulate. But if you combine them together, they create this red envelope, like an AM radio wave. And we can then extract that envelope in the neuron and get an excitation pattern. And if you look, depending on which two electrodes we drive with our two signals, we'll get the excitation in one part of the nerve or a different part of the nerve, and we can really pick which part of the nerve we want to stimulate. So not only are we further away, so this works better over a long period of time, but we're more specific in that we can select which nerve structure we want to activate. And to give you an example, if you take a motor nerve, like the sciatica, it's got nothing to do with epilepsy, it's just a proof of concept. But if you take a motor nerve, we can come up with a map of where the neurons that go to the hamstring are and where the neurons that go to the foot are. And then we can selectively stimulate one over the other. So in some of these rotations, you'll see lots of blue activity. That means lots of hamstring contraction. And in others, you'll see lots of red, lots of foot contraction. We can choose what kind of activation you want. And if you think of this in terms of anti-epileptic drugs, what we're doing here is we're delivering the therapy. Let's say you want a foot contraction without the side effect, in this case, the hamstring contraction. We can do the same thing in the vagus nerve. And because we can do it at a small distance away, because we're not using these cuffs, our dream is to eventually be able to do this all the way from outside with a wearable device and not require any surgery at all. And that's the direction we're heading. So what we try to do, again, to recap, is to combine our ability to record and monitor both seizures and respiratory activity, to detect when a seizure has begun and you're in respiratory distress, to communicate that with the outside world and to receive power, which allows our implantable devices to be much smaller, and then to electrically stimulate either in the brain or in the nerves that go to the brain, like the vagus nerve, in such a way that works over a long period of time and that allows us to activate the therapeutic mechanism we're interested in, but not the side effects that we don't want to drive in a patient. So if we go back to our data set, we can record all this data. We can determine when the breathing has stopped, the seizure has started, to put the two things together. And then now, and this is unpublished data, now we can start to say, all right, let's say you have an animal and look at the red trace. So the red trace is an animal that's having a seizure, and we trigger one of these reflexes. And what we're looking on this y-axis is how much they're breathing. So the red is they're having a seizure, we're triggering the reflex, the breathing tanks, and it never recovers, the animal dies. If we take the same animal before we do this experiment, and they're having a seizure, and we trigger the reflex, the breathing stops, and then we electrically stimulate in the way that I've just described, the breathing recovers and the animal lives. So in an animal model of epilepsy, consistently, we see that when we don't deliver therapy, the animal dies from SUDEP every time. And when we do deliver the therapy, the animal lives every time. So now we're in the process of starting to move this technology into the clinic and translate it, starting with our seizure and SUDEP detection work, and then subsequently we'll begin to work on translating the therapeutic work. And like with anything that we professors present, the work is really not done by us, it's done by the students in our lab. I have many extraordinary graduate students, particularly Ryan Buddy on this list. Michael Williams have been working on the stimulation protocol. Ethan Biggs was working on Ryan. Previously, they identified the mechanism of action in our animal model of SUDEP, and a number of other students have contributed. Vivek Ganesh is working on commercializing some of this work. We have a number of great undergraduate students that I'm hoping will be our future graduate students. And we work with a number of entities, both on the clinical side, John Jeffries, and on the corporate side, in our case, Narava, and we have a large number of sponsors. And with that, I'll close. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Pedro, for that presentation. Several messages of gratitude coming into the chat for the work that you're doing. But we have received quite a few questions from viewers, and we want to try to address some of those. Just as a reminder that the panel is not able to speak to individual circumstances or overly specific scenarios, but we'll try to give the most information that we can outside of that. So one question that I'll start with was from a parent who asked, what are the most suitable devices for a 2-year-old? So I'll take a crack at that, and others can certainly jump in, but I would say for a 2-year-old, one of the most important considerations is going to be the usability. So what is actually practical? So if it's a worn device, just being very, very conscious of whether or not it will stay on, if it will be touched or interfered with in some fashion. There are systems out there that are not worn that might be worth investigating. Talia, Dr. Shear, is there anything that you would add to that?
No, I agree. I think sometimes that's where things like the MFit device might make more sense, but it also, again, is somewhat dependent on the specific seizure type that the child has and whether that device is designed to detect that type of seizure.
Okay, right. Okay, we had a question that was wondering if there are nighttime devices to detect seizures that are non-convulsive. I guess my comment would be that there's somewhat of a gap there right now, and Pedro, I know, can speak to this too, but hopefully we're getting to a place where there are more options in this regard, but a lot of what exists today is specific to movement.
Yeah, we're certainly moving, and the Neurava device picks up more than just movement. There's a neck-borne device and an arm component. The arm component is more movement. The neck component is more on the electrographic signatures that don't require movement. That would allow you to do a detection. Certainly, it's easier if you have movement, but we need to do more than that, especially if you're trying to couple not just seizure detection, but respiratory distress that might lead to death.
Okay.
Just to add to that, in terms of non-convulsive seizures, as I mentioned, most of the devices, as everyone's been saying, are geared towards detecting movement. But if we know that the child, their non-convulsive seizures, they have drops in their oxygen level or changes in their heart rate with those seizures, sometimes a pulse ox or something that monitors heart rate may be helpful.
And we had a question come in that essentially asked, what is the difference or the main differences between a VNS and an RNS? Pedro, do you want to speak to that one?
Sure. So VNS can be RNS. The R and RNS is the operative word. It's responsive. So the idea is that in the original VNS device, the vagal nerve stimulator, you stimulate every so often, all day long, whether you're having a seizure or not. In a responsive device, you're trying to detect an event and then stimulate to prevent that event or to shut it down shortly after it begins. The VNS device that Cyberonics makes, now LivaNova, is moving in an RNS direction, but really it's NeuroPace with their implantable deep brain stimulator that tried to lead the way with responsive neural stimulation. But really responsive is just this idea that you're responding to something you're detecting in the body rather than just stimulating periodically.
Okay, great. Okay. There was a question that came in asking us to talk about FDA approval status and health insurance coverage. To my knowledge, there's been in terms of non-invasive systems, there's the Embrace 2 that has FDA approval, and then there is the Speak system from Brain Sentinel, which is almost more of a diagnostic type system. Does anyone else know of other covered or FDA approved systems? I think those are the primary ones. And obviously that has an impact on insurance coverage and reimbursement and things of that nature. So hopefully that pipeline will become more fluid as more systems achieve the specificity and the validation that they need to. Okay, so Pedro, I think this one I'll send your way. Where are we at with devices that may give us a warning of a seizure that is to come?
So the name of the game for this for a long time was seizure prediction. And there was an international workshop on seizure prediction that was held about every 18 months or so for many, many years. The short version is that no one was able to ever really demonstrate a seizure prediction algorithm that worked. I know that's sort of strong language. They actually put in place a competition where if you had an algorithm that you had published and shown that it worked, that you would submit it to independent testing, and then they would run data through it that you had not trained the algorithm on, and then publish the results. And no one ever had a working algorithm. So we moved from prediction, which is when you know it's coming before it starts, to detection, which is when you discover it's happening already, and then you try to intervene and stop it. Detection is where we are now. Now, there's a possibility, because artificial intelligence and machine learning has gotten so much better, that we might be able to backtrack and might be able to go back to prediction. But for right now, what we're talking about is detecting a seizure when it begins, perhaps at the focal point before it generalizes, in time to be able to suppress the seizure, or in the SUDEP application, detecting a seizure and the respiratory distress, like what we're trying to do, and let the seizure happen, just make sure that the patient starts breathing again after they stop. Okay.
We had a question, it's a little bit on off topic from devices, but in the vein of alerting, someone asked about service dogs or seizure alerting dogs. I would offer the comment or referral to look into the Chelsea Hutchinson Foundation, who has resources and information about that topic. Dr. Scheer, do you ever field questions in this vein?
Yeah, I do get that question sometimes. It's challenging. I think the answer is we don't have a lot of good data or information on how reliable these dogs are at sometimes detecting seizures and alerting. And it's probably very dog dependent and can require a lot of training. So it's not something that I commonly see or would necessarily recommend patients use as their primary form of alert, but it's not necessarily a bad option.
Okay, time for a few more questions. This one for Pedro. Could you expand on how you stimulate a nerve without damaging it? How would you do this with an implanted stimulator? How would you do this with an external device?
So what damages the nerve is not the stimulating, but the mechanical contact. So the cuff is around the nerve and it applies a force. It restricts the nerve. It's like having something around your neck. And then the other trick with the cuff is that there's a metal wire, the electrode contacts that run down from the cuff to the device. And that wire is attached to the cuff around your nerve. And when you turn your head, which you do all day long, you're always applying a gentle tugging motion, or not so gentle, to that nerve. Over the period of a couple of days, it doesn't seem to do any harm. Over a period of weeks or months, at least in our animal models, we haven't shown this in humans. There's really no way we can't do these experiments in humans, but in our animal models, it absolutely, without fail, destroys the nerve over time. So we need to come up with a way that does it without cuffing at all. So we have a loop of electrodes that goes around the nerve, but it doesn't touch the nerve. And so when the nerve moves, it doesn't matter. It doesn't touch the electrodes. It doesn't come into contact with them. And so the trick then is, how do we come up with a stimulus that comes from a distance, whether it's inside and far away or it's outside on the skin, that comes from a distance and gives you the same, or better in our case, therapeutic effect without mechanically coming into contact with the nerve. And that's what stops the damage from happening in animals.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I guess I'll finish with one question, which is, are the opinions and feedback of people with epilepsy being utilized, which is a terrific question. And I would say at Danny Did, we do hear from startup companies quite regularly that are looking to either speak directly with caregivers and patients or want to have us help provide the perspective of our community, which is obviously the primary feedback that you would want a manufacturer to seek. I mean, you could come up with terrific technology, and if it's not usable, if it's not user-friendly, if it's not aligned with what our patients and caregivers are looking for, it's probably not going to pan out. So I think on that front, I can give a positive yes, that we do hear from companies that are making these technologies in terms of their soliciting feedback from the patient and caregiver community. There are many more questions that we received. Unfortunately, we don't have time to take all of them, but we do appreciate everybody tuning in and watching and being so engaged. I do want to make a plug for the next PAME webinar, and if you could put that slide up, it's going to be on June 14th, titled Speaking About SUDEP, Arming the Rare Community with the Latest Research. That one is going to be led by Dr. Sam Latu. And then further into the year, we have the Biomarker Challenge webinar on July 13th, looking at what we learned from the Epilepsy Foundation's Biomarker Challenge. And then in December, just flagging for everyone that PAME will be hosting its in-person conference in Nashville. There'll be a family day afternoon on November 30th, and then a full day agenda on December 1st. So we encourage everybody to look at pameonline.org to learn more about those. I want to thank Jeanne for kicking off this webinar and just to comment that she and her family have been an inspiration to us and to many others in the epilepsy community, for being pioneers in advocacy and speaking out. And we appreciate you, Jeanne, very much. And thank you to everybody for being part of PAME. You know, the beauty of PAME is bringing everybody to the table and listening to different perspectives. So thank you to Dr. Scheer. Thank you, Pedro. Thank you, Jeanne. And this session will be recorded. So look for a link to come from AES to share the recording, and feel free to circulate that amongst your networks. So with that, I think our bases are covered, and we hope to see you at our next webinar in June. Have a great day.
Thank you.